done that in defense of resistance, in the memory of the resistance, and the right to sing of the story of the African people of Southern Africa without shaming those people. He is an author of a book, Odyssey of Liberation, a memoir of a rebel advocate. I must tell you, Dr. Sikahane, that in Uganda, the terms rebel, the terms rebels for the legal profession are it's a word that has gained a lot of significance in the last few months. Also, the idea of the legal rebel is an idea that has gained a lot of significance. Also, the idea of decolonization has gained a lot of significance in the last few months. And so you come at a time of great relevance, and we are truly humbled that a person who doesn't have time, who sits as a judge, who has a lot of cases, not only in the political South Africa, you've also been a commercial arbitrator, and I think you are still one of South Africa's leading commercial arbitrators. So as for your seniority and for your time, we are truly and absolutely humbled. With you right now is an audience of Ugandan lawyers. I must particularly salute Mr. Ali Sekatawa, who I'll be giving a microphone later on. Mr. Sekatawa is the one who really told us about you and about your book and really pushed for us to have you on. And I thank you, Ali, and I really salute you. But I must also say we have a number of people who are on this space. The audience you're addressing is an audience of lawyers mainly. There are very many lawyers, but there are also very many non-lawyers. I can see even professors. I can see professors from the university are also on. And as a starting point, maybe just before we hear from you, Doctor, I will ask Mr. Sekatawa, I think he's on. I will ask Mr. Sekatawa to just say a word, and then I'll come to you, Doctor. Ali, please unmute and just say something.
Introduction. Thank you for hosting Dr. Muzi. Colleagues, I have read the history of South Africa, particularly, as you all know, this site in the east, we relate to South Africa on two major events. One was the Ngoni migration in the 19th century, where our brothers left South Africa after the Shaka Zulu wars and so on and migrated east. You know, as you move up to here, most of us, in a way, to that history of Ndava, Shaka Zulu, and all that. Have an attachment, an umbilical cord attachment to South Africa from the second for the liberation of South Africa, and the first, party, indigenous party in Africa. Now, as followers of Pan, you all know that, as Edison said, even the fighters for ANC were in Uganda in the early 1990s and 1889. And I think some of us who are old enough, some of them were actually in our schools, some of the children of that revolution. And we know Dr. Muzi is one of the fighters of that period. I don't know whether he got opportunity to come and train in Uganda here in Kawewe. The book by Dr. Dr. Muzi Ellison, for your information, his second name is Sikakane, and it means we stand and finish what we start. In simple terms, you must complete whatever you have started. Inspiring, especially the fact that his background, high levels of poverty, and his dedication. And I wanted to read this. view, he dedicates it to every African child and adult born into the margins of the human condition and whose lives are a perpetual dehumanized as if they are not worthy of inhabiting this earth. Many of us, I would say, relate to this story from where we have come from here in Uganda, and it's to many of our African.
Because there is also an intersection between the role of missionaries and colonial conquest, which happened in South Africa and it happened in Uganda. I think a known missionary, Alfred Tucker, played the role played by many missionaries here. So that's our law has developed, if you call it development, from that colonial context of these two countries. And so I'm going to talk about law in that context, because in South Africa and in Africa as a whole, until we've touched the very sources of our law, which are colonial in nature, and if it's colonial in nature, therefore it was designed for colonial conquest. And so anyway, coming back to me, I think I do say in the book, I'm a rural boy. I grew up in rural areas, abject poverty in what is now known as KwaZulu-Natal. And I've also grown up later in my life during the struggle in Soweto. I was happy that the song was about Soweto, because I also consider myself a Soweto boy. And I'm originally a student leader in the 80s, an activist, a teacher, a lecturer. And I came to law because, as you all know, law, at least when we are far from it, is something that we think is designed to change society. It means it's dynamic. And I had tried to be a priest, but that we will leave aside, because it was my concern all the time that we need to find a way for Africa to develop its own. And so when I became a lawyer, after being a teacher, a lecturer, a political advisor, one of the things that I thought South Africa has not done since independence is to de-Westernize its knowledge systems, to de-Westernize the notions of law, to de-Westernize the ways of seeing and ways of being, and to de-Westernize everything else we've assimilated ourselves into. And by that, I'm not suggesting abolitionism, that we must reject everything we know. But I'm a lawyer now, and disappointed a little about lawyers, because when we are law students, we're usually activists. But that activism hardly outlasts graduation. And so law in South Africa, as it is in all post-colonial, or let's say once colonially controlled states, tends to remain the same, as if Africans were sleeping when the colonizers came and therefore had no systems. And so my context of the law is that it has to be steeped in Africa's agenda of liberating its people. And so I dispute the notion of the neutrality of law, the positivist approach that we are taught, because nothing is not political. And so when I represent people, I also subscribe to the notion that justice is not the exclusive preserve of people we like or people we agree with. And so I've had experiences in South Africa in all the cases that you mentioned and many more. But let me zoom into the Zuma one, because it tends to be known, and it's for someone who's vilified, and sometimes the notion that he is vilified affects lawyers and how they choose to represent people. But for me, it was not just my what I call my obsession with the underdog, because there is that obsession on my part. It was also because I think law tends to be used in post-colonial states and post-apartheid states in particular as the extension of colonial rule. And inhabitants of the African continent hardly confront this question because we are uncritical of the law. We are uncritical of, well, sometimes not even uncritical. We seem unable to imagine ourselves without Western notions of the law. We've not been able to think of ourselves as worthy human beings, worthy intellectuals, born of heroes of this continent that developed structures in society. So we tend to fall into the trap of thinking that our being, our whole being, and our systemization of society only came with colonizers. We knew nothing, which is a notion I dispute. So my representation of people is in that context as a lawyer. But of course, one faced difficult things because in South Africa we had our classes that are moneyed classes, white classes. And if they are not white, it's Africans who are aligned to those moneyed classes. And so my representation of him faced that. And in every case that I've done for him and others was practically to indicate to society, to judges, to young lawyers, that justice is not the exclusive preserve of certain people and people we like. And that has happened in many cases that I've done. And my idea of the law is that whether you are in Uganda, Nigeria, in West Africa, or Ghana, on the southern tip where we are combined by one thing, and it's the intersectionality of the problems that were left by the colonial experiences. And those colonial realities remain in our law. And one of the challenges I keep making to the judges, to the students, and everybody is our ability to imagine ourselves as knowledgeable people born on the continent where there were knowledge systems. We are not creatures of Western knowledge. We are victims of Western knowledge. And our role must be to go back and read classes, privileged classes. Then we've not done enough. And this calls on us to challenge the rules, to redesign the law, to dig deep into Africa's own dispute resolution mechanism, to question our love for the wig and the gown, the attire that we use. I'm not suggesting no attire at all. To question our affinity to Western notions of what a lawyer is, and think about law that would take out the African child from misery and dependence. Let me end it there for now and take different questions on the specific cases about the judiciary, if there are any.
Yes, I think we have a number of specific cases, but if you could just contextualize for us what the Jacob Zuma cases were about, because a lot of people here, from our vantage point, we simply saw the riot and how that representation of, for example, of a former president ties in with the idea of representing the downtrodden. And I like the quotes, the law must not be a servant of privilege. And would someone not argue that the president was the epitome of privilege?
It depends. He was not president when I represented him. By the way, he had just been, let me say, kicked out in loose language. And you're right, a person who's a former president or president literally seems powerful, and in relative to an ordinary person, he is powerful. But relative to power in society, to who controls the narrative, who controls who we see as bad in society, who controls who we must dislike, it doesn't matter whether you are president or the Pope. When you don't control the narrative in the media, what I call the tussle for mind share. Who controls the minds of people, what they think, what they like, what they dislike, what they see as superior? I think he became a victim at that point, a victim of a very powerful system. And my defense, his case originally comes from what was called the arms deal, where he was first accused of taking a bribe from a friend called Shabir Sheikh. So that's the first thing. And of course, he was an MEC, which is like a minister in a province when that happened, not in the national cabinet. And that case developed, and while it was developing, he was again charged with another case. I was not involved in that one, the rape case, of which he was acquitted. But the one about his fraud and racketeering case and corruption case has been running since then, for 2 decades now. And it never ends. I no longer represent him. Eventually, I had to move on because I was fatigued. We're still very close, but you get fatigued. And he became the boogeyman, in my view, of post-apartheid South Africa. The boogeyman, as I think you have in your countries, there are people who just become scapegoats for everything that's wrong in the country. And so I was not representing him because of anything else, except that whatever people think of him or any human being, they deserve justice and defense. And then there was a case which was the Zondo Commission. I represented him in that too, which of course, and I've said this in the book and I continue to say it and I believe it, was a grand scapegoating sham in the history of South African politics, where people who be together in the struggle, as it always happens, are turned against each other to a point where they devour one another. And I think it was a battle that was designed to project certain groups of people as more corrupt than others. And I represented him there because there was no evidence, and he was being dragged into that commission yet again, so that you destroy everything that you think he represents. And as an African lawyer, it's also very important to be a bit familiar with the political dynamics of your clients and what they are defending and why they are being accused. And so in a way, those cases for me, sometimes I would know that he would lose, and that we would lose. But those cases were important because you also want society to see for itself the weaknesses of a justice system when it hates somebody, and our inability, even post-colonial state, to understand what equality before the law should be, to understand the nature of justice. That, as I always say this, and I say it in the book, the people who need justice most are not our friends. It's actually people we despise, because our friends always get justice from us. The test for justice is how we deal with people that we despise or dislike. That's your test. Do you put them through a just process? And that is the cases that I've done for him. And I think we were able to show to South Africans what the weaknesses in the system are. And eventually, when he did not go to appear before the commission, having asked for a recusal, he was sent to jail. Our constitution says incarceration must happen after a trial. Only apartheid detained people without a trial. President Zuma is probably the only person in post-apartheid South Africa who was detained for months without a trial. And that's the depth of the injustice. But I was happy about it because it brought up to society that we too who fought against oppression, against colonialism, when we have power, we can abuse it. And abuse it to fight smaller battles and seek validation and crumbles that fall from the master's table and turn against our own to the exclusion of everything else we fought for. And for me, that was as tragic as it was, that this old man who's 80 years old was sent straight to prison without a trial, was the lesson that I thought was necessary for society to reflect about itself. And he continues with that case, the criminal trace. A colleague of mine, Advocate Mpofu SC, who's a friend of mine on the same floor with me here, continues to represent him. And I think eventually the state has spent more than it's trying to recover. By the way, it's not because he stole money. The charge is that the friend gave him money, and that money was a bribe. It was 500,000 rand, seemingly, over time. And it calculates even things like transport to school, pizzas bought for his children by this friend. All of those are separate counts. And curry that was bought by this friend to send to children, or money that friend bought gave to his children. So for me, I don't represent people only because they are going to win. Sometimes I do so in a losing case just to be able to show the pitfalls of the system for people to judge for themselves whether post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa is what they fought for, and whether the African person in the world, in the globe, in global politics and global justice matters. And I think that's the question for me, is that Africans in post-colonial states have not realized that in the broader scheme of things, we live in what I call neo-colonial realities, because knowledge is still Western. Our likes and dislikes are still Western. And those who control natural resources and economies in our country determine what we know, what we like, who we like, and all the grand narratives. And that was the case, and it continues. And I hope one day, because it challenges our judges too. You know, I think judges in post-colonial states must think seriously about their notion, their role, because it's very easy for judges, depending on how you appoint them, it's very easy for judges to end up being servants of ruling elites in society. And those ruling elites may well be remnants of the very thing that colonized us. And I think law is nothing if it's not liberatory. And you said to me about rebel. I think every lawyer should be a rebel. Because rebel means questioning critically and radically what oppresses society in front of you. It doesn't mean conformity. A rebel is someone who's not afraid to venture into truths that are not told. Maybe not truths, but to challenge weaknesses that they see in society without fear or favor. And I think if lawyers can't be brave, no one can be.
Thank you, Doctor. If lawyers can't be brave, no one can be. And the test for justice is how we deal with people we despise. I really love that test for justice. When you've talked about President Zuma, I could think of a parallel. Someone who is supposed to be sent to prison for contempt without a trial, but that's another matter. But allow me to ask Alfred, really, to hand over to Alfred to give the next question. And for those who are just joining us, we are with Dr. Sikakane, Muzi Sikakane, senior counsel, an acting judge, a senior counsel, a lawyer, a rebel. And he says that every lawyer should be a rebel. And if lawyers are scared, the rest of you should be extremely scared. Okay, he hasn't said that, but that's my interpretation of what he said. And he's also given us a fantastic background on what on who he is and what he does. So if you're just joining us, you're welcome to this conversation. It is us, our usual team, Edison Karahanga, Mercy Makabai, and Alfred Muyaka. Over to you, Alfred.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Edison. I would like to, based on Dr. submission, is to get deep into, especially regarding the Zuma case, to get into the idea of the aspect of law isn't justice. I'm sure he has somehow said at one point I read his writings and noted that courts should not be courts of law, but should be courts of justice. And he is quoted to have said that what is just is not always legal, and what is legal is not always just. Now, in the Zuma case, some judges hated him for representing President Zuma, and they were very impatient with him because it was important to them to demonstrate how much they disliked him, and they could not even hide it. So, and that's the same thing which happens, like in most cases which he handles, law, politics, and public statements collide together. So my question to you, Doctor, is how does the idea that law is not always justice shape your approach in representing all those big influential clients you represent, and most of them were politicians? I hope my question has been got.
When I say law is not always justice, and it's because basically we tend to take this notion of positivism, the myth that law is neutral. It's the myth that law is neutral. And I think partly we miss the point that at the heart of governing society, of arbitrating disputes in society, but not just in society, between people, is being just. And if law does not concern itself with justice, then it's an exercise in futility, because justice forces you to understand inequalities in society, prejudices in society, psychological barriers in society, right? We try to do this as judges when we do right at the end of the trial and people are to be sentenced, and then mitigation. We're trying a notion of justice, but we try it at the end. It means we try at that point to look at justice simply as sympathy. But justice is actually a fundamental notion in any society. And so, for me, when law is practiced without an eye on justice, it can be oppressive. And that is why when law is in the hands of the privileged, when law is in the hands of the racist, when law is in the hands of moneyed classes, law becomes a weapon of destruction against society because it is unjust. But if justice was at the center, if justice was at the center of law, a couple of things would happen in this continent. First of all, the skewed patterns of ownership, of wealth, of education, and human settlement would be different. If justice was at the center of what we do, everyone would be able to access it. And the fact that those who are poor in this continent, whose poverty can be traced exactly back to those who control our economies, it means what we are doing at the moment in the practice of law is continuing as if society is equal, because we are not challenging the fundamentals that cause injustice in society. And so my understanding of justice has been always to plead with first judges to be judges, because being a judge comprises two qualities. One is understanding the law. Now, all of us can understand the law if we are taught, we have a law degree. The part that is difficult is being a good person, good and just human being. That's probably the most important component of being a judge. The other one is just a necessity because you must understand the law. And I think that is lacking. And it's lacking because most of us emerge from missionary and colonial education that teaches us not to question it. And lawyers emerge from law schools whose emphasis is actually not just constitutionalism, but liberal constitutionalism, where the individual tends to be regarded as fundamental, when actually Africa has no history of that. Africa has a history of collective justice, of caring for society, for communities. But liberalism as a theory itself, emphasizing individuals, has forced us to look at law that way without community context, without looking at society in general. And my sense in my cases has been judges and lawyers should be at the heart of understanding the political context of a society. Because if you don't understand that, if you don't understand why a young man from a township in Soweto, you don't understand why his mindset for survival is just crimes. You think he does that because he is black or he's uncouth. You're failing to understand historical factors of the society to which you must dispense justice. And so we need law that understands ideology as a set of ideas, that understands where Africans come from, that understands how Africans resolved disputes in their communities. Because we are taught to look at ourselves as African people as inferior, and therefore we think we are incapable of creating alternatives to dispute resolution, alternatives to what we call adversarial styles of litigation. And all of us, people like wearing the wig, and it represents what we think of ourselves. It represents our notion of law. And so I think justice is always at the center of what I do as a lawyer. And that is why I hardly reject a client who needs justice. And it doesn't matter whether I agree with them or I don't. The fact of the matter is that justice must determine what laws we write rather than the other way around.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Justice must determine what laws we write other than the other way around. One of the issues, I think, as practitioners of justice, that has really bedeviled in Uganda, one of the issues that really disturbs our justice system is the ability to deliver justice quickly. We have the average remand time, that is the time people spend in prison before trial, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. We have people on remand for as long as 10 years before they can actually be tried without getting bail. We have massive backlogs. We have cases that take 5 years, 10 years. I think land cases take an average of 5 to 10 years. South Africa extensively uses what they call acting judges, advocates like yourself who practice and who bring. So in your case, you don't just bring this perspective as a lawyer representing clients. You've also had opportunity under the laws of South Africa to also sit in judgment on cases and to bring justice, not just to make the case from the bar, but to resolve the issue from the bench. And in Uganda, our law provides for it, but since 1995, we've never actually invoked that provision of the Constitution. So before we even go into the legalese of that provision of the Constitution, what safeguards are there to make sure that your appointments as a lawyer, who at the same time is a judge, you serve as a judge every once in a while, how is your independence and your competency guaranteed? Because you come with this perspective that, justice is even to the people you despise. We have to listen to what people are saying. We have to be fair. These are the qualities of a judge. Is he shouldn't just know the law, but he should also be a good person. You bring those skills from the bar and the bench, and you keep moving in between. What's your experience with whether these appointments preserve judicial independence, the appointments of lawyers, and basically how that system works within the context of South Africa? And is it part of the decolony idea?
Yeah. Let me start with how. Let me first acknowledge. I saw my compatriot here, Professor Isaac Shai, in the audience. Greet him. Let me start by saying the differences. I see that in Uganda, for instance, this has tended to be acting as a judge. Those appointments have tended to be given to people who are sort of retired, or it's not the lawyers who are in practice. If I'm not wrong.
Yes, but you're right.
What happens here is that lawyers, both attorneys and advocates, who are regarded as experienced, they don't have to be senior counsel, but experienced, and people you look at beyond 15 or beyond 10 years of practice, and even more. The judge president of each particular court would then approach the societies or the bar or the individuals that he knows or she knows has experience and could be a judge. And it tends to be in that this happens in every division throughout the country. So lawyers, and I mean by lawyers, I mean both attorneys and advocates, are an important component of dealing with the backlog. It's still not enough because people take stints of 3 weeks, others a month, others 2 months, and they come back to run their practices. And of course, and that would work. It doesn't just deal with the backlog, by the way. It also just trains lawyers while they are in practice to see how being a judge is. And by the time they become a judge, those who have judicial ambitions, at least they have had stints of acting for some years. And so in a way, it also prepares, because there's nothing you can do with someone who's retired. You can't teach them anything. But those who are coming into the system, and I think it's better to try and implement the acting role in those who are in the practice of law so that they come in and assist the backlog, but also it trains them for the future. And in a way, it helps with what I call the juniorization of judgeship. It means when a person becomes a judge, they have some sense, because when you are sitting on the bench, I tell you now, it's invaluable that you also see yourself as you see other counsel make a presentation. You see your faults, you see how terrible you are sometimes, and you know what irritates judges. You get more experience, but it also forces you not to think partially, because as lawyers we are trained to think about the interests of our client. And acting as a judge forces you to think for all parties or for both parties. You touched on something very important, and this point is about independence. And if you go all over the world, there are different ways in which people approach independence of a judge. Others say you must create, as you have in your country, they must be appointed by the Judicial Service Commission. It must be independent. South Africa does the same. And the independence of a judge is important. And you were saying, but if you are a lawyer, how do you guarantee independence? I think independence of any person is not a function of structural divisions and how they are appointed. That's just the perception. I think independence is an issue of integrity, personal integrity. And we don't go there largely because it's a difficult thing. It's like telling people they must not be sinners, they must be good. So even if you appoint judges by way using the private sector, using the Judicial Service Commission, powerful classes in society will still influence that process anyway. You can have the Judicial Service Commission that takes its narratives and instructions or understanding or grand narratives from powerful classes in society. So it's the same. You're going to get judges that are preferred by those powerful classes. So I think we must train the African judge first to understand the conditions of Africa. And secondly, I think it's a job that we must really insist requires, and this is the only way we can guarantee independence, is people of the highest degree of integrity. That is probably, for me as a person, I think if the person has no integrity as a human being, as an individual, it doesn't matter how you appoint them. You can have all the pretenses of separation of powers, but they are all pretenses if judges have no integrity as persons, and they are servants of ruling elites. And you talk about people who are in prison for a long time. Well, I don't know in Uganda, but I think it's the same as here. If you went to those prisons and checked who is there, which class of society is awaiting trial, it's young men and sometimes women from poverty-stricken communities who can't afford a lawyer, who can't afford justice, whose life is regarded as not important. And that's not a coincidence, and it's not something we should ignore, as if people who are poor have a propensity not to be good. And so we need to look at that too, that the fact that our jails are full of a particular race, a particular class in society that can't afford justice. If you went to those prisons in Uganda and South Africa and checked, knocked on every door, you will not find that the majority are those who are wealthy or children of the wealthy. It's children of those who don't matter. And I'm not saying they're not criminals. They may have committed crimes. But those long years they spend before they come to justice are caused by the fact that they do not matter. They have no voice. They come from communities that have no voice. And so we need to speed up in our courts how we try cases. And I think in Uganda in particular, it would serve not just the judiciary or the legal profession to introduce judges, acting judges from the profession, but it would also help society ensure quick justice. Because quick justice does not mean there will be no mistakes, but it means the impact of that mistake is not as profound. So someone who stays in jail for 2 years awaiting trial is more prejudiced than someone who spent a weekend. And so I think we can learn a lot from each other about those. But about independence, I think we need to rethink the training of lawyers, in-service training for judges, but largely and lastly, just social conscientization of both lawyers and judges to be aware of the context in which they operate and the fact that, you know, the vestiges of colonial degradation remain with us. They remain with us. What we do when we think we are dispensing justice, we may be ensuring the continued survival of privilege, the continued survival of injustice, the very thing that we should be against. And so for me, I think injustice actually should be enemy number one for anyone who's a lawyer or a judge. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For your feedback on this issue of appointment of mission-based judges. My questions are two. One is along the lines of, obviously you represented top fact that you've been appointed a mission-based judge along the way of your career. How have you social pressure, which obviously exists once one is appointed as a mission-based judge, vis-a-vis the private practice which you want to thrive because you'd like to also practice and build your career as an advocate. I see that you you did create a law firm. So I'd like to understand how do you think other lawyers can balance this in Uganda in case we do start to appoint mission-based judges? And I think the other question is, what would be your proudest moments and what challenges would you think are the biggest when appointing mission-based judges and also when performing the roles as a mission-based judge?
I think to balance practice with your mission requires commitment. Of course, one has to find time to serve society. It means when I go to act as a judge, of course, it can never pay me what private practice pays me. And no African can assist the state of Africa if money has the same value as humanity. And I think in your time as a lawyer, even with the hardest pressures of survival, you must find time to serve society. And that's how I look at it. I find time to serve society. I find time to represent people who are indigent. Half of my practice since I started, and it doesn't mean I'm wealthy, I'm not at all. On the contrary, I struggle like all of you. But I was taught that money is not everything. And I think we need that balance. It's difficult, but I think we must always find time. So when I'm acting as a judge for a month, I suspend my practice completely, divorce myself from talking to clients or attorneys, and I focus on dispensing justice and try and make judgments quickly so that I'm able to dispense justice quickly so that people can either live with the decision I make. And when I come back to practice, of course I'm behind, but I think it's a question of planning. And I think my thing to lawyers is that you can never be so busy as to find no time for other human beings, for serving society. And then I think the other question about my representing people, I think you were mentioning the cases I do. I think it creates pressure. It creates pressure on you. But I think when you've reached a point that I've reached, well, I've never had a time when I was not under pressure since I was a teenager. And therefore it comes with burdens. But you asked me about what was my proudest moment. Well, there are many. But my proudest moments are cases that I've done that did not pay me money, but were worth something in society. For instance, it's a case that is never known that much, that I did, is where poor children were not getting textbooks in a province called Limpopo in South Africa. And I did that case and won it. And I was doing it for free. It took me months. My proudest moment was getting justice for poor school children in Limpopo and all over the country to get textbooks that were being delayed by bureaucrats who didn't care. And the books were there, sitting in storerooms. And for me, that was an important thing. So my proudest moments in my legal practice have been where I think I've defended justice, even if it made me poorer. You know, most of my cases make me poorer. But I think we have to teach this, we have to leave this, that money is not important. Instead, money has caused divisions in our society as we chase it. Because when we chase it, we do that at the expense of people we love, at the expense of society and community. And so those are my proudest moments. And when I've represented someone whose life would have been destroyed had I not intervened.
I think we would also like to benefit from your proudest experiences, your proudest judge, and especially as a mission-based judge, and also challenge you'd say is the biggest challenge for mission-based judges?
I think the biggest challenge as a judge, it's what I said earlier. It's our notion that judges are neutral. And I think that notion is exaggerated and sometimes confused with objectivity and fairness. I don't think judges are neutral. And I don't think a judge should be neutral. I think a judge must be conscious about justice, must be conscious about what injustice is. And the judge must be conscious about imbalances in a society. Because you can never judge. That's why you are called a judge. You're not a motor mechanic. You are a judge because we have judgment to juggle different interests and factors in society. And being a mission judge for me is that our mission is actually breaking chains that tie Africa to injustice that was brought onto it by colonial oppression. And some people will tell you that is politics. Well, law is politics. And if law is not politics, what are we doing? Because apartheid in South Africa was a legal system. Colonialism in Uganda and everywhere else since 1894 in Uganda, British settlement and colonialism in Uganda was a law. It's law that made it happen. It's law that made injustice and colonial conquest survive. It created laws. And therefore, a counter to colonialism is laws that are consciously liberatory in character. Lawyers and judges who are conscious about reversing the curse of oppression on people, the curse of landlessness, the curse of poverty, the curse of violence. And so when you are told that you must be neutral, you must ignore the fact that the scales are tilted in the favor of the privileged. We are being taught to perpetuate injustice. And so I think it's a difficult thing to do in a country where we are not supposed, or in a continent where we are not encouraged to question Western knowledge. We are not encouraged to question Western notions of law. Every student I've taught and asked them about law, they know nothing else. They can't think of anything else except Roman Dutch law and what we were taught. And one of the things we need to do, and I'm very happy with this forum, because you're better than what we do. You're beginning to debate, to reflect on what exactly is the mission of a judge in Uganda, the mission of a judge in this continent, rather than a judge being just the repository of Western knowledge, Western norms, and liberal notions of constitutionalism. And I think that is the challenge. It's never easy, because when you challenge the system, what my brother called the rebel, it's difficult to be a rebel because it's a lonely path. And when you challenge a system, you are an outsider. But it's important for a judge, for lawyers to force themselves to be insiders. It means we must not stop the fight to challenge knowledge systems that are anti-African, systems of law and justice that are designed to perpetuate what our grandfathers, our grandmothers, and all our forebears went through. And our children will not forgive us if what we did with law as lawyers was to simply perpetuate it rather than question it and make it applicable to the African experience. And that's what I try, without venturing outside the law, is to interpret what we have in a manner that is just and fair, but takes into account the unique conditions of the inhabitants of my jurisdiction.
Yeah, thank you.
So much, Doctor. When you're speaking of lawyers serving society, as if you are speaking to me that we must find time to serve society, that you can never be busy to find time to serve society and not money. And even in your book, you challenge young lawyers urgently resist the urge to treat law merely as a ladder for personal gain, but instead you call on young lawyers to engage with the law as a tool for justice and transformation. So when you are making those answers, you are really passionately speaking to us personally as a young lawyer, but living around that bit, to go the bit of the legal rebel in you, or that the rebel advocate, and especially the legal rebel in a colonial system. You see, we can all agree that there are very many compliant lawyers and a few rebellious ones. Basically, we have too many decorum lawyers. One, and we have one now on call in you, only advocate. And as you rightly noted, history has never been changed by those who simply followed the rules. I think that's why you're calling upon us not to just look at the law how it is taught, but also to refigure it to fit into the African setting and define what law means to us as Africa. In your book, you really speak with urgency to young lawyers, warning them against cowardice and encouraging them to resist the urge of validation at the expense of the truth, like and not to conform to anything. And I think that's what usually does a rebel advocate. You live in the periphery of the system, but again you challenge from within. Describe yourself as a rebel advocate, and you have even lived it. So my question now, in a legal system which is still shaped by colonial codes and reasoning, you can advocate, and how do you disrupt the system without being excluded from it? That's my question, Doctor. Thank you.
So let me start with the early thinking. You know, historically in society, you can go to biblical times. People who changed society or who changed dominant thinking were few. So activists and rebels have never been conformists. And most of them at a particular time in society have been condemned. Galileo was condemned. Ken Saro-Wiwa died in Nigeria and everywhere else. But it doesn't mean you should stop. And so you write in that way, it will always be a lonely path. It's not a losing path. It's a lonely path. You know, Thomas Sankara was alone with a few people. And of course, even now we are told to ridicule General Traore and anyone who speaks against the system. So when I say lawyers must be brave, is that for me, rebelling against a system, I'm not suggesting abolitionism, that everything we have must go. But I'm asking for originality. I'm asking Africans to rethink, to become the source of knowledge about law. Does this law that we borrowed, if we borrowed it, or that was bestowed upon us, forced on us, does it, on a daily basis as we face it, does it solve the problems, perennial problem of injustice, poverty, inequality, crime in society? Has it helped us? And if it hasn't, if your country remains on the peripheries and as it was at the dawn of independence in Uganda in 1962, well, it's time to question it. And I think lawyers must open channels like you are doing now of bravely discussing issues that no one wants them to discuss, questioning the Constitution itself, to say what exactly is a constitution. All constitutions, if you look at them, and I've read yours as well, it's not dissimilar to ours. It's a liberal constitution, is that constitutions emerged from post-war periods, like codified and written constitutions. And the African continent has been tempted largely to borrow from Germany and Canada largely to solve problems that are so unique. And one of the first things we must do as lawyers is not to be afraid to be called deranged. It means the ability to take the bull by the horns and question known philosophies, known and accepted jurisprudential notions that are taken as sacrosanct. And I think for me, it starts with that discussion. It starts with the ability to question what we know, and to question why we know it, and to question why we don't question it. And as I always say in my lectures, the problem with coloniality as opposed to colonialism, and let me just say, that distinction I make is historically this. Colonization for me was the process of occupying, settler colonial occupation as a process. Coloniality was deeper, was the knowledge systems, the distortions of the mindset for Africans to succumb, to look at themselves as subservient. And so one needs to look at law with that in mind. And as I was saying, if you ask the fish, or you told the fish that it's in water, it would laugh at you because it doesn't know. And Western knowledge is like that, or all knowledge, is that people are unable to imagine knowledge outside what they know. And I think it's a tragedy for Africans not to explore legal systems that originate from their own ways of being, their own ways of thinking, and the realities of their people. And the reason we don't do this, by the way, is because we live our lives seeking European or Western validation. And we are scared of being called foolish by people who are powerful, who historically oppressed us. And so what I'm calling for lawyers everywhere in the continent, we must start discussing jurisprudential questions that we've not questioned. We must start questioning the dress that we use, because it's not neutral. We must start questioning the terminology that we use in court. We must start looking at the hierarchy itself. We must start looking at our courts and whether this idea called the rule of law is really the rule of law, and where does it meet the will of the people? And this idea that a judge or judges by their nature possess the wisdom that should supersede the will of the people is a notion we must discuss again. And that's what I'm asking. That's what being a rebel is. It's not going around fighting anybody. It's the bravery to question what is not questioned. And that is why the terminology in post-colonial states of something called transformation is something I use sparingly. Have used the term transformation. We use it a lot in South Africa. But I actually think it's a tragic terminology because it means accepting that all you need to do is to tweak a little this and that in the system that was designed for colonial conquest. And I believe that you must sometimes keep what you think helps you, but must completely destroy what was designed to oppress your people and start something new. And that's what I think Africans are scared of. That's what Africans in the post-colonial states are scared of. And that fear is caused by what I call the pitfalls, the power of coloniality, the mind that told us that we are inferior, we are unable to think, there will be no stability if we don't borrow from elsewhere, from Europe, from Western knowledge. I think the world has a lot to learn from African intellectuals if they can grow a little spine and self-confidence. We are children of warriors that created cities, that created civilizations and pyramids. And no one should tell us that we're incapable of developing systems, legal systems, that speak to the unique concerns of African people in the post-colonial era to reverse their plight.
Thank you so much, Doctor. For those who are just joining us, we are with Dr. Muzi Sikhakhane, the Senior Counsel from South Africa. Please, if you have questions, type them in and send them to us. I've received one. I'm going to read it out. But I think that last point you've made, I think, is very profound. We are Africans. We are children of great people. We are the only survivors of colonialism. I'm told the Red Indians no longer exist. The Aborigines no longer exist. For us, we survived colonialism, and certainly we should be able to strengthen our minds, because we are the children of survivors as well. And for me, this takes us to our next question to you on this issue of colonies. Can Africa truly decolonize without first imagining the advocate's role in the society? Because you're saying we need to question the dress, the robe. Many guys here like their robes. And many people respect lawyers for those robes. Can we, and those flaps, how can we reimagine the role of the lawyer or the advocate in the society?
Well, that's the debate I would like lawyers to have. It's an uncomfortable debate. But we start our constitutions with some preambles. In your constitution, for instance, you start with a preamble that says, we, the people of Uganda, recalling our history, which has been characterized by political and constitutional instability, recognizing our struggles against the forces of tyranny, oppression, and exploitation. Right? We have a different one in South Africa. We say something similar, but I think yours is better. We say something like this, and I'm coming to the challenge that lawyers must have, because our constitutions and what we say in the preamble should tell you what we are prepared to do. As opposed to yours, ours says, we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity, and all of that, right? One of the comparisons I'm going to give you about the two constitutions is that, and I'm not criticizing your constitution, it's the same as ours, is that even as we codify what is the mission of the post-colonial state, there are things we are scared to mention. We use polite terms, instability, injustices of the past. We are unable to confront head-on what is it that we are reversing. Is colonial conquest by foreign settlers on our continent, period. But the reason we don't say that is the reason we can't change things. You cannot change a problem you can't pronounce. And I think one of the things in the constitutions for me is that the challenge we have, what we are reversing, is what happened to an African person, what happened to his or her continent and to her people and her resources. And I think every law that we put in place, for me, is not worth the paper it's written on. If since 1962, and in our case, since 1994, half of us, if not all of us, are still complaining about the same things, it means politeness has not helped us. And all I'm asking for is that we must be bold in calling out what atrocities are we trying to reverse. We don't have to be polite. If you read, and I challenge you to go read the preamble of the Bolivian constitution, it's braver than most. I'm not saying it's a perfect country, but it calls things by their names. You know, our colonizers, if they read our preambles, both Uganda and here, would not see the sins they committed. They would not see their names. They would not see the dead bodies and poverty and hunger they left that we are trying to deal with for decades. And so I think our constitutions must first be bold about what it is, our historical context, and mention it, because it's a constant reminder of what law is designed to do, which is it's designed to create a just and equal society. That's what the Constitution should be doing. It's to reverse what necessitated it. And if it doesn't, it's of no use. It's a document that preserves the status quo, tinkering with institutions but delivering very little. And I think lawyers need to think about the colonial nature of our law, and whether, I don't know in Uganda, but I think in South Africa, my criticism is that the economy that causes inequality is still in the hands of people we continue to try to please, the remnants of colonizers. And I think we need laws that reverse the distorted wealth patterns, the distorted ownership patterns, the distorted knowledge systems that are anti-African, that keep Africans living in squalor, injustice, poverty, dehumanizing poverty for that matter. And I think if lawyers can tolerate that, and there has been talk sometimes that I'm a little emotional about my approach to law, and it's not something I'm ashamed of. I think if injustice doesn't make you emotional, you are not human. If you can be cold and clinical and unattached in the midst of injustice, you are not human. And if you've not found something you can die for, you're not fit to live. And I think lawyers need that courage and need to approach law that way, so that it's worth something to our children, to our communities, and it's a service and tribute to warriors of all these countries that were colonized, who fought, and yet they were defeated, but they fought. And every day we conform. Every day we do nothing. Every day we wake up just to conform and comply. Every day we wake up just to go make money. We betray the warriors that died and bled fighting the settlers. And I think we need to rethink the law, rethink its effect on society, the role of lawyers, and what it does for society, not to society. And I think judges and lawyers have to rethink what has influenced the writing of these documents. And I think these documents, when I read them, all of them, you can see the influence of German jurisprudence, of Canadian jurisprudence. And we've always gone to countries that have problems that are not similar to ours. And I think it's time in Africa we shed some notes about our unique conditions of injustice, of equality or inequality, and create constitutions that will liberate rather than maintain.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zikakane, for that. I think when you say it's time we share experiences, you are certainly preaching to the choir. I have questions from some people in the audience. And after that, so I'm going to ask you one question from someone in the audience, and then I'm going to hand over to Ali Sekatawa, who I think also has some questions. So Ali, you'll unmute, but after Doctor answers this question. This question comes from a very interesting person. The person who's asking this question is, I don't see him on the space, but he has sent this question, and he's the president of the Uganda Law Society, Mr. Isaac Semakade. And he says that you lead a team representing Judge Mbengene of the Eastern Cape against a sexual harassment charge in the ongoing Judicial Conduct Tribunal. Without speaking to the specifics, and he says the proceedings have been broadcast live, and I think he's watched them, and he's particularly watched your cross-examination, and he calls you the legal rebel Just for context, the president of the Uganda Law Society is known as the Ligorebo here in Uganda, and he's saying that the proceedings were broadcast live on television, and the cross-examination by the Ligorebo was the highlight of the proceedings, and he says it's been adjourned to 11th July. Without speaking to the specifics of that case, which is a case you're handling, and without going into the details, he wants to know what impact high-profile judicial conduct tribunals, such as the one involving Judge Mbengene, have on the public perception in South Africa of the judiciary's accountability and transparency.
Glad you don't want me to go to the specific because it's an ongoing case. But I think these fights, these battles themselves, are not unrelated to battles, the undercurrent battles in society and dynamics and fights between classes within the legal sector. They are not unrelated to those battles. And of course, when they are made public as it is, yes, it's good that the repositories of power, who are human, are scrutinized publicly. It means the public can decide what it thinks about those who have power. It has its own impact, of course, that people first may well think that a particular judge has no integrity. But also it teaches people, as I always say, that everyone must be presumed innocent until the process is done. But cases of this nature are a problem because everyone has a view. And that view is not born, has no relation with the facts. And that's the problem with cases of this nature, of sexual harassment, and maybe of racism, maybe of that have tribalism, maybe things that are hot and sensitive in society. And so the pressure about these cases is the fact that even as the case starts, people have made up their minds. People have made up their minds. But I think the public nature, you see it in this particular case, I'm the one who argued, because I came to it late, that it must be made public. Because when a case is not public, there is mischief played by the media. It means the public is reliant only on snippets of the media. So if the media is controlled by a particular class, society can only hear or see what media owners want. And I think it's important that it's public in the sense that people can see the good and the bad about power relations in society. And I think that's a good thing that it happens. What may be a bad thing is also the fact that in South Africa, I don't know where, you guys are lucky. I think maybe the colonizers left. South Africa is unique in the sense that the colonizer did not leave. And so battles in society also take that form. Even within the executive, even within the legislators, even within the judiciary. And so the public nature of battles of this nature, although some people think it denigrates the integrity of the judiciary, I think it shows the public the conduct, the nature, the dynamics, the power relations in structures of people who occupy public power. The problem with judges is that sometimes, in fact, most of the time, they forget that they are occupants of public power. They are the repository of public power, and sometimes they want to be dealt with differently. But I think when you are a repository of public power, you must expect scrutiny, criticism. And in South Africa, there is even a line. Judges say when you criticize a judge or judges, you must provide your reasons and set them out. It sounds very attractive, but it means my mother, who's uneducated, is unable to scrutinize someone who's powerful like a judge, the way he feels, the way she feels. So I think those cases are very difficult. And by the way, most of us like doing our work privately. And the pressure of going to court, I think because most of you are lawyers, you will know this. Just going to court gives you sleepless nights just to present to 10, 11, or 5 judges. When you walk in, you tremble, even if you thought you had a good case. But what people don't know is walking inside a court with 10 people, representing someone they call a rascal, and there are 4 TV cameras beamed to the world, and you must still do your job. And as you do your job, people have taken sides on the issue. They don't need the facts. And so I think that's the pressure of these cases. But you wouldn't be called senior counsel if you didn't expect that pressure. And you also need the generosity to forgive society for judging you, because that's the nature of the job. You are there because you understand that context, you understand, and you must I look at law, at my job, as educational, even at the height of pressure, even at the height of persecution and belligerence from a judge, a cantankerous judge. I see my role as teaching. Even that behavior by a judge and my interaction with that judge, I see it as an educational process for society to see and judge for themselves. As long as I'm respectful, I'm rigorous with a judge, but I'm respectful. And I think it's important to preserve the integrity of the judges, but it's also important to point out that judges are human, that judges themselves can be controlled by elites in society, that judges, if they are careful, they too, because they are human, can fall prey to all sorts of things. So sometimes even tragedy of one person is a benefit for millions of people. Somebody at the funeral of George Floyd, a priest at the funeral of George Floyd, said when God wants to help society, he sends a human being. And that human being goes through death or tragedy. And I think there is public education in these cases, and there is public education in tragedy.
Okay, thank you so much, Doctor. We're going to hear from Ali, but we had a plan for 1.5 hours. I think we are 10 minutes above our time, and I know that you have court, I think, in the morning, so you're going to go and burn the midnight candle. So maybe Ali, if you could just ask one question in under a minute, and Joy as well, then you shall take both those questions at once. Joy Mbabazi, please ask just a very short question, under 1 minute, so you can take both those questions at once.
Okay, thank you, Elson. Dr. Muzi, mine is the land question. I have been to South Africa and Namibia. I realized the distortion in the land ownership structure, where probably 80% of the population is landless, and the major parts are either parks or gazetted farms, compared to maybe like Botswana, again, where land is mostly distributed amongst the people, and in Uganda here, where it is mass ownership of land, but also the biggest challenge, because over 60-70% of the disputes here in Uganda, legal disputes, again, partly because of these colonial laws and the historical structures. So I wanted to hear from you, in light of the expropriation, what's your view at a higher level on the land? It can be addressed in light of this other discussion of expropriation, compensation, but also dispute resolution. Ellison, you'll also allow me one more question. because Doctor writes very profoundly about. The one is the legal one we are looking at, but he writes about religion and education. Those two twins as tools of coloniality, and therefore the need to address them when we are talking about decoloniality. Now here, Uganda, as you know, our motto is for God and my country. We are very religious, many Christians, Muslims, and so on. And to our education system is, as you know, based mostly as a colonial. And I think also South Africa. Again, I wanted Doctor on what he thinks we can do in respect addressing the question of decolonization in light of those items in either our organization, our history, or our mindset. Thank you.
Okay, Joy, under 1 minute. Joy, please ask your question in under 1 minute, or actually in under 5 seconds. Since Ali has taken 2, I think we'll give you half.
Half a second, I'll take it. Thank you, hosts, and thank you, Doctor, for the time and accessing us this amazing information. I'll definitely come back to listen. I'm glad it's being recorded, all protocol observed. Now, I'll head straight into the question to observe my 30 seconds that have been given to me. Now, we have been advised and encouraged as young lawyers to read beyond the law, to immerse ourselves in history, political thought, and philosophy. And there's been an emphasis on true transformation, what true transformation requires, and that is more than just the legal knowledge. Now, on this background, Doctor, could you kindly share some of the books outside of the legal field that you have read that you would say deeply influenced you, and you may tell us why they influenced you, because I believe that it is in books that we pick out different knowledges and open up our minds to different jurisdictions and get knowledge that you're pushing us to go out there and get. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity. That would be my question for now.
Thank you. Let me start. Thanks for those questions. On the land question, you're so right that the land question, the land issue or land ownership patterns in South Africa and Uganda was similar, but I think in South Africa we've done very little. And I think it's because our political settlement itself was designed. It's what I call wanting to go to heaven without dying. We wanted freedom, but we didn't want to hurt the colonizer, the oppressor. And so we have something that keeps the system intact. We want change. We also are like someone who steals your car. And when we reconcile, but the thief must keep the car so that we keep the peace. And I think that's what causes what I call skewed land ownership patterns. And also because those who were oppressed must buy the land back, give the one who stole it some money. And so I think we've not dealt with the issue properly. So the Expropriation Act, there's a fake debate in South Africa at the moment about the expropriation and white farmers going to the US. There's no expropriation in South Africa. 80% of the land is still owned by those who owned it before 1994. And so I think we still have to do much as lawyers to take cases for our people to own the land. But also you will see that in Article 237, you deal with, in your constitution, deals with land ownership. We do that in South Africa in, I think, Section 25, which is about property. And I think we must look at the Mozambican one if you want to see how land ownership is. They believe, well, they say ownership is owned by the people. And so it's phrased differently from ours. So I think we need to look at those constitutions without law anyway, my belief is that no human being must own what they found on earth. But that's just my socialist views. So I think that's it. On Christianity and education, I think oppression and coloniality came from both this classroom and the pulpit. Spirituality is a very important tool of making someone succumb. And I think we must look at education and look at religion. And I don't want to call it religion. Let's call it spirituality to reverse things. Because I think colonialism and missionary education and Christianity, and I'm a Christian, by the way, but I think Christianity had a role of despiritualizing an African person and removing them from the sanctity of the soil where they were born and how they worshipped. And I think we need to revisit how we worship, how we teach, how we learn, and what values we learn. On the advice about books, I've read so many books, and I think one of the things is I read all the books by Fanon and everybody else. But I think commentary from African authors, I spent time reading a Nigerian author, Ben Okri, just about society. So much is hidden in his prose about the African society. Ngugi himself, I read a lot of his novels just to understand society. But every time I talk to young lawyers about how to look at society, I ask them to go and read Fanon's chapter on the pitfalls of consciousness, because it talks to everybody in every situation who looks at himself as inferior, to reconscientize themselves. And I think those are the types of book I read. I read religious books, and I read every book in order to critique society. And I think lawyers are best advised to read what we are told is just politics or novel or literature, because hidden in there is knowledge that would make us better lawyers. Because I think lawyers are like engineers, and they shouldn't be like this. They are probably the most narrow-minded professionals, because they are not encouraged to read beyond the affidavits and law books that they read. And I think if they read more outside law, they would become better critiques of law and better practitioners of law.
Thank you, Doctor. I can see a few engineers and pharmacists on.
I hope they didn't feel insulted.
I'm sure they didn't. And I think we're starting to wind down. We had asked for people who have questions. I think I'm advised the president of the Law Society has advised that he's watching it on YouTube. So we are being watched on YouTube, TikTok, and on X. I think we had asked for a few questions. I'm not seeing any at the moment, and I know that, Doctor, you're under a lot of time pressure. But Alfred, I'm told, has one. I think there is one that has been sent to Alfred. If we could just have that one, and then we just do winding up remarks.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Sena. And Doctor, I know I'm buying into your time of going to buy the midnight wave, but since we are at South Society, I just use proceed from your time to just answer this one question. Talk of us having a timely discussion which about you talk about rethinking the training of lawyers, and this one believes that this is a timely discussion that believes we must engage in. And so he's asking, how can law students and young lawyers question existing systems without sounding indisciplined their senior colleagues? Because there are points when you think the training, which is it's about now thinking the training of lawyers was also hinted on it. So he's wondering how probably young lawyers can question their existing systems without sounding indisciplined their senior colleagues, because something you can do something and your senior says, what, you don't respect your senior, something of that sort. Thank you.
Basically, obedience and decorum.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think if society didn't have young people who were rigorous and frontal, society would not have developed. And I think being critical is not being disrespectful. And I think we must encourage critical thinking in our education, and it's been lacking. And so, without disrespecting anybody, I think lawyers and students, it's their job. It's the job of students and intellectuals to be different. And I think anyone who is a senior or a teacher and encourages students to conform rather than to question should not be in the classroom. Because the classroom is a place not of teaching. You know, human beings are not wheelbarrows into which you pour. The classroom is a place for the production of knowledge, and that includes the teacher and the learner and the context. And so I think students must be respectful, courteous, but no one should tell them not to question. We wouldn't be here if people like Galileo and others were punished for telling us truths we know now about that the earth evolves around the sun, if they always round. People thought it was flat. It took someone who was young, who was questioning, who was prepared to die for that knowledge, to teach us what we know now to be true, but he was punished for it. And that's my advice to lawyers, to students, and those who are senior. Students question me every day. Young lawyers question me every day. And that, for me, the best process of teaching is when I'm being questioned.
Yes.
Okay.
It's okay. Proceed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sikakane. I have one final question. I think he'll take under a second. I've only allowed him Mr. Dalton Kawesa because he is the head of news of one of the Ugandan television stations, and I don't want him to give us bad news. But Dalton, I'll give you half a second. Just half a second, because Doctor really does have to leave. Dalton? I think, Dalton, you've muted.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nelson. And Doctor, for the record, I'm not a lawyer, but I've enjoyed this conversation.
He's the head of news, so he's the man in charge of setting the narrative.
Doctor, I wanted to find out, it's related to the previous question. There's a growing trend among lawyers that when they have disagreements or they don't get the right judgment in the courts of law, they involve in proxy attacks. That my question is that how in the spirit of rebellion, it hasn't really manifested the way you have maybe the ULS president has manifested it or yourself has manifested it, but it's taking a trend that is a bit scary through proxy attacks in judicial officers. What is the fate of the legal profession and justice sector if that kind of trend continues? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's an important question because being rigorous and being disrespectful are not the same. And I think it's a function of both judges and practitioners to create a conditions of trust. You know, what you see and you say, people say all sorts of things about judges. Yes, should not be encouraged. But it's a function of the relationship that lacks trust. And those who are holders of power, you don't force people to respect you, by the way. You don't tell them by regulations to respect you. People will naturally respect you if they think you have integrity. And I think while we encourage people to be courteous, we must also encourage holders of power to have integrity. Because when they have integrity, they are unlikely to be questioned the way they are. And I think sometimes we focus, as your question does, you're focusing on lawyers or people criticizing judges. And you are right. But you must also know that people who are leaders and holders of power have a responsibility to earn the respect rather than to demand it. And I think if we had that context and that ability and that discussion, you would have less of those attacks and reckless statements by practitioners. But of course, they must be discouraged. And I think respect must be mutual all the time. All the time. Lawyers must respect judges, and judges must respect lawyers. Human beings must respect human beings, regardless of their station and their power and their age and their gender.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for that. I think now we're going to start winding this down. Allow me to really do a special thank you to Yanga Mputa, the tax ombudsman from South Africa, for helping to make this very possible. Doctor, any closing remarks before? Usually, what happens here is I take the privilege as the host to make the final closing remarks, and I've also been asked to re-sing Nkosi Sikelel Africa. I don't think I'll be able to do that. It was a one-hit wonder. But any closing remarks, Doctor?
Usually when you are invited to speak to people, the assumption is that they learn it from you. But I just think I learned a lot from the questions, because they forced me to go look at other things, see different perspectives. Hidden in questions is also knowledge. So I'm very grateful for the invite, and I think I learned more than you did. And I hope we will engage again, and Africa will be free again.
I am 100% sure, Doctor, that we certainly learned more than anyone else. We are blessed entirely by your knowledge, by your perspective, by the time that you've taken. I was particularly, when you spoke about our constitutions not addressing the challenges directly, and our laws not facing up to the issue of the colonization of our minds, the emasculation of our spirits. I remembered reading that there are about 120 synonyms for blackness, and most of them are offensive. Blot, soot, devil, foul. While for the other race, there are things like cleanliness, chastity, innocence. So history and linguistics have conspired to make us feel bad. And I think your presentation today to what was a legal community, but to really up our spirits and strengthen our people, I think is something that we are profoundly humbled for and grateful for. Thank you. And we are so thankful that you could take time off and off your busy schedule. I know you have a matter tomorrow. You're going to study again through the night. You've told us so much about cases that are in the public domain, the people biasing the public before you can even have your trials. I can tell you I have some experience with that. And so I think we are deeply humbled, first of all, that you took time off your busy schedule to speak to us. We are grateful also to Ali Sekata for helping us to organize it. We are grateful to those who have joined us and sat with us for this time. We are very grateful to your team for the patience that they have had with us as we've gone through this exercise. Above all, we are grateful for the opportunity to exchange ideas. These ideas are being shared south of the Sahara, north of the Kalahari, east of the Limpopo, and we are extremely grateful to you, Doctor, for taking the time out. We're also grateful to the Law Society. I saw the secretary of the Law Society. I saw the acting secretary of the Law Society. I see the president of the Law Society also. I see people from the media. I see judicial officers. I see academicians. I see government officials. I see a lot of lawyers, and I see very many ordinary people. And I don't mean ordinary in a bad way. Very many of our clients, our friends, who have come to listen to you, and I'm sure you've all been blessed with the interaction that we've had here. We are deeply humbled, exceedingly grateful for you and for the time that you've spent joining us here, wherever you've joined us from. There's such insistence here that I should try my luck again singing Nkosi Sikelel. Maybe, Doctor, you will bear with me as I try one or two lines from the South African anthem and sang in the most random discord that exists This is nothing like Miriam Makeba, but or Masekela, but something that like this in Kosi. Sikelele Afrika, malupakanise upando lwayo, ivaye mitandazo yetu. Kosi sikelela Tina Lusapolwayo. For those joining us from where you're joining us from, thank you so much. Thank you, Doctor, and to everybody joining. Good morning, good afternoon. I think I do. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you so much.
Sounds the call.